Hey everyone, welcome back to Looking Outside. So last year we saw a real tipping point in the permacrisis that we're living in, with more conflicts than in any single year since World War II. We're in this permanent state of crisis, a world full of risks we can't seem to navigate fast enough, even risks that we saw coming like COVID-19. We can't seem to be able to adequately prepare for. So this is perhaps a dark but important topic that we're going to be talking about today, of proactively exploring emerging risks with somebody who has experience leading risk management and projecting their future impact, Futurist and CEO of the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, Dasha Krivonos. Welcome to the show, Dasha.
Thank you so much. I'm glad we finally made it happen.
We did, yes. All right, well, Dasha, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so the question is where to start. So I guess customary to maybe say a little bit what I do on a daily basis. I mean, you introduced my title, but I started to identify as a former economist because I'm a trained economist who did all that for 10 years. Also spent a little bit of time doing that in each parliament when I was finishing my degree. So I tried to save the world first through politics, realizing that was too slow and short-sighted. I moved to the corporate sector, where I spent a decade working as an economist in very different capacities. And then towards the end of my tenure there, I met at the Institute where I am now, which has turned me from an expert into a flexpert, which is a nicer way to say generalist. So now I'm a futurist, which is then, I guess, a freely available title for anyone who wants to work as a future professionally. So, so I get to apply everything I've learned in school and then unlearn it and relearn it through the lenses of my colleagues who do everything from philosophy to biotech, technoanthropology, history, and we have a whole wide range of topics we cover in-house. So I guess that's a professional background. I will also pull a little bit on my personal background, as I was born towards the end of the Cold War. So I was born in the 80s and in Soviet Union, so on the other side of the Iron Curtain, which first of all provided me with a language spoken in 13 different time zones, which is, of course, an asset today. But it also has given me a different perspective on things. Sometimes, at least, it's given me a second perspective. And I've also learned the hard way that none of them are actually right. I mean, usually both, and all of them incorrect in their own way. But it gives a little bit of a humble approach to the truth, if you will. So I always know that somewhere I'm wrong, and so is everybody else. And I guess it takes me into an explorative phase much faster than I otherwise would have been.
No perspective is right. You're so correct that when you're born and raised kind of in one, let's say, like cultural context or political landscape, then you're thrown into something completely different, like a different part of the world where people live and buy things and operate very differently. It shifts your mindset completely to question whether the things that you were raised by, have to be the way that they are.
Yeah, there's that. And also, I mean, looking at the world now, to give you an introduction to the many different crises we have, I know for a fact that there's a whole lot of people who see this completely differently. And I also know that I was brought up in a different historical context. Coming to the other side, I also know that that context was wrong, or at least, everybody has their own truth, which means when I feel very sure of something today, I remind myself what that was like. And then every time I meet somebody who was very convinced of a certain point of view, I also challenge in a different way than I otherwise would, because facts are relative, as it turns out. So I think it gives you this, first of all, a humble approach to your own convictions, but also it gives you a better sense of how to discuss topics without barricading oneself and the other into a corner from where we can't discuss anymore.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that is something that I wanted to ask you about, because obviously now leading the Copenhagen Institute and you're, the CEO, so you have an amazing job at an amazing institute. So we do a little bit of work with the institute and we're partners with McDonald's. But you're dealing with a lot of companies, and companies are usually looking for their preferred future. They almost want to reaffirm the plans that they have are definitely going to happen because there's a lot riding on it. So when you're trying to challenge yourself and stay humble around what the future could hold and whether this is the, air quote, right future, how do you provide that kind of provocation to the big companies that you work with?
It's actually funny you ask, because just over the last couple of months, and I've been doing this for a while, I mean, I've been on the other side, this transaction also, right? Being on the receiving end of the challenge. And just a couple of months ago, it dawned on me that I'm becoming more a therapist, an economist, or a futurist, or because so much is embedded in the dynamics in the room rather than any analysis you could ever bring, any charts you could show. So the dynamic, the convictions, the roles, the interplay of the roles in the room. So you need to spend much more time mapping out the stakeholder landscape and read the room rather than try and convince someone with a lot of facts. Because, I mean, if anything, the last Trump presidency also showed us the facts, kind of alternative fact. Trying to convince someone who was convinced of something entirely different is futile exercise. So the first thing I've started doing recently is, first of all, I'm mapping out where I think people are in their thinking. And that's usually a good starting point. But then try not to prove anyone wrong, but try and get them to substantiate their opinions, especially if they're about the future. You rather discuss the way towards their future. Because already, if they have to articulate it, they realize that this is not probably as realistic as they thought. So it's basically allowing people with strong convictions and seniority in the company to backtrack slowly and softly, because no one wants to admit that we're wrong. So I think it's providing this option of backtracking. Then we can explore all the other futures, but you need to get people out of their conviction of this one particular one. As you said, it's either the preferred one, or even better, if it's a predicted one, one they've gotten used to looking at. Everybody loves a great estimate. We're currently working with a very big multinational player, if not the biggest and one of the biggest in their field. And even though they're buying into the whole discipline of foresight, after 4 hours of intense work together, they will still ask me, so when do we get the forecast? It's getting people comfortable with the uncomfortable. It's basically settling into, you may not want to look that way, but you rather look. It's better to look ahead now than be hit by it later. So I think there's only one way to get people to open up their minds is to do it themselves.
Well, it sounds like then it's kind of a dual challenge because you have a lot of personal, human bias that you're trying to work with, and you have a lot of kind of corporate bias, ingrained behavior that we have inside of a business where we're looking for certainty and we're looking for, like you said, those forecasts because we have to make a decision. So you can't make a decision if you don't have a perspective on something. So you have to kind of land somewhere. And generally in a business context, you kind of have to sell it. Even if you're not fully confident in it, you have to sell it because you have to get somebody else on board, and it kind of keeps going up the chain. So which of the two do you think is the biggest, I guess, challenge in business right now? Is the structure of a corporate landscape that you're trying to navigate, or the more human bias that's starting to come in and that people struggle with overcoming?
Well, I think right now we live in a time where they're coming together in beautiful synergy. So they're kind of reinforce each other because we still have a legacy of a corporate structure and a certain demographic leading the corporate structure who were raised to make decisions. And, it's not a critique at all. It's the product of the time when we taught all of these leaders. So there's the pride and the corporate culture that is inherent still. And then we live at a time where it's almost impossible to make decisions with certainty. So they're kind of reinforcing each other. So rather than embrace uncertainty, most are just grappling for some sort of predictive power in any model they can find, right? So somehow they bring out the worst in each other. Well, great, you're telling me that nothing is certain, so this is going to lead to some sort of decision paralysis. But that's not the intention, right? So a colleague of mine, he usually uses the analogy of a football field and here, European football, real football. And no offense to any listeners you may have across the Atlantic. And basically saying that if every football player would just stand there and wait until he could read the entire field and get everybody else to stand still as well, then we would never get a football game going. I guess that goes for all kinds of football, also the American football kind. So the fact that every football player needs to immediately read the direction and some sort of probability distribution of the next event, they need to act on that, right? So you need to be able to absorb a lot of information and make a decision anyway. So, and I think more and more corporate environments and sectors right now become like these football games with a lot of things happening at once, but you still need to keep moving. But there's a difference between basically looking out and deciding on a direction or a play, or doing it blindfold. I think what many people do is they go, well, there's too much to grasp. I'm going to blindfold myself and play this game anyway. And I think that's a very big difference. So it's about actually having this overview, acknowledging there's many moving parts, but then making the best informed decision and just go, this is too much. I'm just going to run.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And foresight and futures gives you a lot of frameworks to be able to navigate through that because like you said, it's a lot of information that business leaders just generally are trying to, take in and interpret themselves, make decisions off of. And then in this kind of growing, we say complex, volatile, etc. world, it feels like they can get very easily overwhelmed with all of the things that they should be considering that maybe you come in as CIFS and you say, yes, there's all of these things you're looking at, but there's also all of these other things that you're not paying attention to. So they can very quickly become overwhelmed. But then going back to the start of the point, foresight can give you those frameworks to be able to make sense of what you're seeing or, think about different ways to prepare for what you're seeing. So what I'm curious about then is because you've come from the business world, you've got the economics background, and I think in one of your podcast interviews you said that, with the economy, you're looking for the constant. So it's probably a very different kind of application of your skills that you're now using for futures. So what do you think is the most useful and impactful thing about foresight that you're applying with business leaders?
I think it's forcing them to consider what if. And you also mentioned my risk background. The problem with foresight, a bit like with risk management, is you can't see the value of mistakes not made. You can't see the value of risks not materializing, right? So if you mitigate, if you're really good at it, it starts appearing as a cost purely because all else equally, you don't know how things would have gone. It's a bit like a vaccine. If you only look at the spending for vaccines and not the drop in, say, potential infection rates in society, well, then you're only going to see a cost. So I think bringing those two things together and talking about the what if with leaders, I think sometimes the most effective thing is say, well, if you continue doing what you do now, where are you going to end up? And that's usually a very powerful picture because most of them realize, especially in the world that is so rapidly changing around them or developing at least, they all know that if they continue doing what they do now, they're not going to end up where they want to go. There's also this study that you may have seen where they're basically trying to show the value. I mean, down to numbers. So I think they're looking at the growth in market cap and profitability, and the companies that are qualified as vigilant, they're actually outperforming their peers. So it's not just an intellectual exercise, let's sit down and do science fiction. This is actually a good business proposition. What I like about the study, as you also may recall, there's also a group of companies that they call neurotic. And that basically means it's overdoing it. And this is the decision paralysis. Oh my God, everything is moving, or we have so many options or so many risks, whatever it is, that you simply overdo it. In risk management, you can mitigate yourself out of any opportunity, right? You can just transfer all risk, but there's going to be no gains left. So, gain is also a risk. You just need to do it in an informed manner and in a well-structured manner. Foresight is pretty much the same. So I usually ask, again, back to how do you get people to give up their convictions? It's basically what needs to be true. I think that's the one. I would usually go out and think, the future is always urgent, but it's not important.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the case. So there's never been a senior leadership team I would meet with, not in my former life, not in my current life, who would tell me that, future is not something we look at. It doesn't matter. It's not an important topic. It is. But then when it gets down to either setting aside the time or including in their agendas, it's always bumped down to be the last item, and people are going to start leaving for the next meeting, or someone's already left, or let's just discuss it briefly, which is probably the worst thing you can do, then leave it for another time. So always important, but never urgent. A bit like the way we treat climate, right? So we keep discussing how important it is, but the urgency is not really there. So we need to move from the what now mindset. Okay, things are changing. What are we going to do? Or our customers acting differently, or the price point has changed, or say, there's another president that we expected. So what now? I mean, if you do the what if, then you're already ready. So it's not about basically considering all scenarios, but zooming in on a few so that you already have a playbook when things start moving a certain direction, which means you can move faster. You avoid the shock to an organization because you've already talked through it as an option. And you can simply just get moving faster. When I left my last role with Maersk, I was heading up the enterprise risk team. And then someone told me that behind my back, or our backs, my team had been called the business preventing office. They meant well, and it was meant as a joke, but I kind of was like, guys, seriously, I mean, we were the business robustness office. So risk is being seen as business preventing conversations because you force people to acknowledge what could go wrong. And I think foresight is seen as this, some sort of science fiction conversation of what if. Both are business critical. And I think more and more companies are waking up to that reality because let's just face it, the last at least 4 years, if not to say before the financial crisis, last 14 years have been quite interesting in the sense of uncertainty.
I think, yeah, there's so much richness in what you just touched on there. One thing is, Amara's law that we overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term. So it's equally, I think, that we say the future can wait, even though the future's coming at us, whether we like it or not. We kind of say, well, we have too many crises that we're trying to manage right now. We have too much on our plate right now, without realizing that that stuff is still coming at you. And then you're going to be dealing with it, like you said, like you're going to be playing catch up. But equally, that a lot of these things that are longer term, maybe macro, like sustainability, the ERM teams of the business world, they're seen as kind of the naysayers. Like the future, I think, can be viewed as quite negative and catastrophic and dystopic. And so those teams that are looking longer term are generally, unless they're like the creative pontificating, what if, science fiction kinds of teams, they're generally kind of the pessimists in the room. And it can be a bit of a downer as well. I think maybe that's a little bit of that reputation that you mentioned that you had, right?
Probably. And I think I fully understand the emotional response of an organization. I think that's probably what I learned the most. I mean, the first thing I learned when I joined the Institute is my profession was inferior, right? So anyone who loves their line of work, at least most economists, we think that we are in the only right academic field because once it becomes numbers, then you can project and you can build models and the rest of it. So that was the first learning for me, was that my discipline is inferior, or at least it's something that needs to be complemented by everything else. That was the first thing. And the second thing is I'm slowly realizing that most of what happens in the corporate setting, even the biggest, the best, the smartest, the most global, I mean, it's emotions. For as long as we have people in these rooms, it will be an emotional response to whatever's happening. Sometimes it's limited to instinct, as I would have done this before, have a gut feeling. Sometimes it's a personal emotional response to, I don't like where this is going, so I'm just going to decide based on what I hope will happen. So, I mean, more often than not, I realize that it's about the emotional response in the room. And no one is immune to that. And it doesn't matter if you're the CEO and you've been that for 20 years. I also have an interesting experience with the expert bias, which means the more expert people become, the more sure they become of the discipline, but they also become very limited. And I have the greatest respect for experts because if we think about it, these are people who have dedicated a big proportion of their life and time to knowing more and more about less and less, right? So they focus and they specialize, but it also means they get more and more narrow in their view. I don't know if you guys do this, but in Denmark, you can go for a team building a day and you can play, we call it penguin soccer or football, which basically means you're wearing a cone and all you can see is through the cone. I mean, it basically spells havoc, right? But that's the pun of it. And I think experts are a little bit like a football team playing penguin football. So you kind of need to know what is the kaleidoscope through which they're looking. And I was sitting next to a doctor at a wedding the other day, and you chat and you try to get to know each other. And of course, I said the most natural thing, and I meant it, like, you're a doctor, it's extremely important. And he said, yeah, but other professions are important too. And so, for instance, an electrician or a bus driver, I mean, I agree. And he says, yeah, if a bus driver drives 20 people into a ditch and they get hurt, that's bad. Or if an electrician wires things wrong, people could also be in danger. And I was like, that wouldn't be my interpretation. For me, a bus driver connects A to B, makes cities go around, mobility. Electricians mean we can work at night in Denmark because it's just dark here. So, but for him, everything was seen through the lens of a doctor. That was, I mean, for me, that was like, wow. So, which means doctors will be looking for, some sort of physical impairment within people. Politicians will be looking for political craftsmanship and solutions. Economists are going to give you something that fits an economic model. Engineers will do the same within their field. So, having a lot of experts in the room can be a very interesting experience because you're overwhelmed by their knowledge of your field, sometimes intimidated. But it's important to step out and say, okay, these guys know everything about this little piece of the pie and they're very good at it. But what we're discussing is just adjacent, or the solution may be just outside it. And who is not in the room to suggest something else? So I think the expert bias is probably the most interesting and most dangerous one, because it comes with great sense of confidence. So the more expert you are and the more experts you have in the room, the more they will agree that whatever you're suggesting is nonsense, even though it's quite plausible. And their knowledge will somehow is going to disarm you, right? So the conversation may stop there. So this is exactly the time as a futurist, you buckle up and you say, okay, guys, let's talk, right? And that's probably the hardest step to make, because you will be so overwhelmed by everything they tell you that can't happen. The expert bias right now is probably also quite a prominent thing you will meet in organizations.
And it's kind of to be expected, right? Because that's how we're trained. When you go to university, you pick a field that you're going to specialize in, and in some cases, study it for 7 years. You get into the business world and you're climbing the ladder, and essentially you're going from a finance manager to the chief finance officer. Like, generally, people stay in their lane and they become better and better at what they do. But that obviously then means that they, like what you're saying, they almost get tunnel vision, and they aren't able to as easily see other perspectives. And that's kind of what you were touching on before with the flexpert that you called yourself, which I love. Is it's kind of like the polymath concept. We're hearing a little bit more of that now. Like I always say, we're the expert in nothing, knowledgeable on everything. So we can come in and out and know just enough to bring people together. Do you feel like there's a version of that for a futurist, where we have our own tunnel vision as well? There's something that we're too good at.
Well, see, it's hard. I have to face my own biases. I would say, I mean, I think if you're a good futurist, and again, I can only lightly claim the title because I've worked with people who've been doing this for the last 20, 30 years, right? So I'm a convert, which means I tread carefully within the field. But I think if you're really good at this, this is exactly what you do. You're in the business of challenging your own and everybody else's biases and looking for insights and input from everywhere and just listening, right? So I've made a habit of, at least if we agree on something too soon at the Institute, I try to make a habit of asking myself who's missing or who's lying. Is there an introvert in the room who hasn't spoken because of the way I structured the meeting? Did I speak too soon as a senior, although we do have a very flat structure still, right? That someone else didn't speak their mind. So I think it's about inviting as many opinions as possible. So also another example. So when we had the pandemic, and I assume it was like this in many countries, first of all, we didn't know what the virus was, so we needed the doctors. Then we needed the biotech people to tell us, masks work. Evidence shows that we can stop the spread of the disease if we use masks. Then we had the supply chain guys come in and say, hey, we need masks. We need to source them. We need to distribute. And then we had the politicians come in and say, we're going to make it mandatory. Basically, we've got all the nice experts in the room, then problem solved. Now, if you had a behavioral scientist in the room or sociologist, they would tell you, well, it only takes one person to put the mask under their chin for this to fall apart. And that's what happened, right? So people, they would get them, they would have them, they would even wear them. But the moment there was no one around in terms of authority, they would put her under their chin, they would sneeze at each other. Better yet, they would have a party in the basement with 15 people and we could start all over. Again, all the right people were in the room, but you needed someone who thinks about human behavior to put the icing on the cake and say, it doesn't need to be in place, it needs to be implemented and taken seriously. And that's just one example. Another one is I had a very humbling experience when I just joined. So colleague and I, we went to speak to a municipality, and there were, of course, like many municipalities, in especially in the Nordics and in Northern Europe, we're worried about aging. They need to attract younger people and families, and we need more kids and all that. And then they asked us basically, so what does the future look like for us? And I just sat down, so this is great. In the Nordics, we've got great statistics. I pulled out the demographics, I pulled out the cost. And then my sociologist colleague looked at me and said, wait a minute. Well, all you need is actually to ensure that you have public restrooms within a certain radius or distance from one another. They need to be in an app so that elderly people can read. You need proper lights on the streets and the bus stops. And these people are actually going to leave their houses. They're going to be part of the community, going to stay healthier. They're going to be in better shape. They won't be lonely. And the bill for healthcare, etc., is going to drop significantly if you just have these things in place. As an economist, I'd be like, what? So that was for me the revelation, saying you need different disciplines in the room to discuss the future.
It also made me think about how we come at specific issues or challenges from the kind of the background of the expertise that we have. So it's great to be able to bring a diverse set of people to be able to like critique an issue or to run a scenario together where you're kind of blending all of those skills. And we've done that a few times. At McDonald's, we've done these like mini future scenario sessions where we have someone from the HR team, someone from legal, someone from marketing all together. And the ability for people to really actually flex their muscles is quite impressive. I think people underestimate how well they can do that. Like maybe we downplay our own ability to grow and stretch into these areas, or we underestimate other people's ability to as well. Or maybe we just don't have the permission and the forums to be able to hold those types of sessions, like a scenario planning session where you are bringing together a truly cross-functional team, not just like the marketing and the innovation team sitting together, can be so beneficial.
Yeah, and I think actually, at least in my experience, the latter is the dominant factor, is that we don't provide the right settings or the right circumstances for people to actually be playful, if you will, or explorative, or, imagine what if, because, and what we did at Maersk when we introduced the emerging risk process. So we had the normal risks, which is, anything from collisions on ships and oil spills, and we had 9 different industries in 130 countries. So there was enough risk to go around. So, we had the operational risk, which was something that would happen in the next 5 years. And then we separated the process of the emerging risk. This was the explorative phase. So we didn't cross-contaminate them. And I think that's an extremely important, trick, life hack, tool, is to make sure you separate these two conversations, because first of all, you will spend too much time on the present, you'll run out of time. And second, in the emerging, anything to do with the future, the actual premise is that no one is right. No one knows. So all input is welcome, all reflections are welcome, and it creates a completely different conversation. Because not a single expert in the world knows what's going to happen in 10 years. They can give you a view, and they can be challenged by another expert, which is what you want. But separating anything within the next 5 years from the rest, I think, is, in terms of governance, you need to have these two as two separate tracks, because you may need different people, but you also need a completely different mindset where you invite people to explore. Part of it is also culture still, but more and more companies and senior executives are grappling with how to do this. They actually want to. Mm-hmm. But if you don't do it right, you feel like you've done it, you put, take it off your annual wheel, but you're basically nowhere in terms of value add. And unfortunately, very few companies actually take the time, because again, it's important, but it's not urgent. We need to address everything else and have to do it now.
Yeah, and it's a mindset shift of what you do with all of that information as well, because everyone's looking for that definitive view of what the forecast, what the future holds, what the next 10 years will look like, and kind of forget that we are creating that future right now with all of the decisions that we're making. The future isn't just unfolding in front of us. We're making choices that create that future. It moves from a very passive to a very active exercise. And going back to what you were saying about risks and proactively identifying risks, looking at emerging risks, it's also, I think, a shift in mindset around not just settling or mitigating risk, but exploring risk. It's great that we're willing to focus on the good stuff. I think as a species, that's how we survive. If we basically had to take in and live with the knowledge of what may happen and what may go wrong, I think mentally we would to cope. So I think it's great. We have this optimism for the biggest part of the population. We're somehow willing to disregard bad things and focus on the good things. And that's how we wake up every morning and do what we do, right? If you bring it to work, that's a little bit different, because then you're confusing the likable with the likely and the preferred with the probable. And I think that's a very, very dangerous misconception, because just because you don't like something, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And just because you prefer a particular future, it doesn't make it probable. But there's very often this disconnect, which is why I think this whole what needs to be true is extremely important. So I realized, again, back when we did this at Maersk, the exercise. So when I was on the customer side, and the Institute came to challenges, and, we very much had the response and reaction that I now see in other companies when I do this, is basically that you guys are just, what? What are you talking about? We know where the world is going. And then what we quickly realized is that we had created a strategy
a very good strategy. And again, mind you, we were the biggest in the world. And then at that point, we're more than 100,000 people across the globe. We knew what we were doing. We'd been around for a century. But we then realized that our entire strategy rested on 10 things that had to go our way. Right? So somehow we were already busy discussing what ERP systems we need in place, where should we have the next headquarters, what talent pool, which ships we're going to order, what price, is it going to be Korean yards, or, we were already internalizing this, what needs to happen on the internal processes for this to be a success. We completely parked the fact that we had given the world 10 assumptions and we just wanted the world to execute. So please world, do what we want you to do, and then we're going to be busy buying ships. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but so basically we realized that within those 10 things that we already assumed were going to happen, we put it in our models, or at least in our assumptions, we realized that there were 2 of those 10 that we could actually control, or at least impact quite significant, because we were that big. 4 we could predict. I mean, not everything is uncertain. But the remaining 4 we couldn't control, we could hardly impact them, and we certainly couldn't predict them. But we somehow assumed that they were going in a certain direction. That's pretty dangerous, right? But I've realized that we're not the only ones. Most companies have these assumptions. There's almost always these 3 categories. Things you can affect or even control. Things you can predict. And then the last difficult bucket where you can't do anything and you don't know where it's going, but you've made assumptions, which is fine because that's how you make your, football decisions. But you better keep watching that other guy that you're assuming is going to do something. He does something else. Your entire play can fail. Right, so it's extremely important to respect uncertainties for what they are, which means map it out, point to the ones that are the tricky ones, and keep watching them while you move, while you make decisions, and see how you can adjust. The other cross section I realize that we make in our assumptions is somehow inherently we expect some things to continue. But it's tech development. It's very often tech. We think that tech is just going to go through the roof. Or demographics or something, we expect some things to just continue growing or developing. And then some things we expect to stay exactly the same as they are. 2024, frozen in time. And then some things it would be great if it would go backwards, say, so not a secret that many Europeans think that, it'd be great if the Trump supporting movement would regress. And then you need to ask yourself again, in these 3 categories, how realistic is it? So if we look at, I usually use the example of the moon landing. So from Gagarin goes to space and comes back alive and tells the world, till we put human footprints on the moon, it's 8 years. That is exponential. It's mind-blowing, right? So if you ask me then, we would be on Mars by now, right? They tell everybody, get into real estate, buy a little piece of land. It's cheap now, great sunsets, everything's going to be great. We haven't been back to the moon with humans for 50 years, right? 50 years, complete standstill, not space exploration, not at all, but actually going back to the moon, 50 years of nothing. If you were standing in the mid-60s and NASA had a budget of $50 billion in real terms, this is not where we thought we were going. I think, always ask yourself, what can you control? What can you predict? And what is neither? Be careful, watch that. And then what do you think is going to progress? What is going to stand still? And what is going to go backwards? And then ask yourself, how realistic is it?
So, and do you see when individuals or companies are looking at emerging risks, so generally the things in the fringes that are just starting to bubble up, do you think generally we overestimate how quickly they're going to scale and get big, or we underestimate them and kind of discount?
I think we do both. And this is back to the biases, right? It depends on where you're coming from. But now we have that discussion now, right? It was very on AI. So we went straight to either paperclip, so, we're all going to die, or it's going to solve everything. It's become a little bit more nuanced still, because now it's, it's making its way through the population, or learning how to use it. And yet you still have, of course, the dystopian warnings that we still have no idea what we're doing or creating. And then there's those who think, come on, guys, it's never going to turn into Skynet. I think we're doing both depending on what you and I started discussing, the biases, the whole Immanuel Kant, I see the world as I am not what the world is. So I think we do both. And I think most people would actually be able to point to 2 different dynamics, to put them into 2 different categories. So it doesn't mean that I'm someone who underestimates. It means that I have a certain field that I would overestimate, and I have another field that I'm willing to completely ignore.
And reflect on your own personal bias towards this issue as well. Like maybe what are you afraid is going to happen, or what are you really hoping is going to happen? and how that might be dictating your view of AI in this example.
Exactly. And I think it's a little bit, so I think, say you and I were going on a road trip, right? Somewhere very remote. And then suddenly I'd had an updated map. I said, you know what? This is not just a dead end. You and I are going to go full Thelma and Louise if we don't do something else. Now, wouldn't it be great if we saw that just in time because there was the last left turn and we could do something else? Yeah. I mean, so it's not about me telling you there's a cliff coming, because it's still coming, right? So this is about being able to map it in time to do something else. So on a personal level, yes, again, as I said, it's a great preservation mechanisms that we can grasp all the negatives as individuals, and, maybe our brains and emotions not wired, because that's how we get up in the morning, every morning. But as companies, you owe it to yourself, your stakeholders, shareholders, employees, whoever else is relying on you, to make sure that you have the latest updated map and that you take the right turn in time. Because just going there, hoping it's going to go away, yeah, I mean, that's just negligence.
I love that analogy too, because, like the Thelma and Louise, they got to that point where they're at the cliff's edge, and they have to make a decision. And really, if you look back take a few steps back and then further back throughout the movie, it's decisions that they made that led them to that point. So you're kind of asking leaders in business to go to the very start of that movie and try to imagine what if all of these scenarios played out, so that once they get to the cliff, they're like, oh, we actually thought about this scenario and we have a better idea of what we should be doing in this situation.
No, exactly. But then again, if they wouldn't go off a cliff, maybe Brad Pitt wouldn't have a career. So, everything has a consequence.
Yeah, I think it's the cowboy hat.
Definitely. But I think that's actually an interesting point, because it's also, as you said, people, especially now, we feel that the future is negative. And by all means, there's enough to be concerned about, right? Now with the COP going on, and yet another COP, and now we basically register 1.5 degrees increase, and then the conflicts. I think it's important to remember that, as cynical as it sounds, the future is neutral, right? There will be winners and losers in every scenario. Unless we're hit by a meteor, then yeah, we're done. But other than that, now we're also seeing this divide between, previously it was East and West, now it's North and South. We're seeing that the West is becoming more isolated in its views, that everything we think that is bad and happening right now, not everybody agrees with us. So before we deem the future to be negative, I think we need to ask ourselves why. Because, again, if you're better prepared, you can still turn it around. And second, there will be someone who thinks this is a great future. Because, mind you, most of the conflicts that we have are proactive choices by someone, because they have a future vision that is different from the past. They want to change something. They're creating death and destruction on their way, but it's just that they have a future vision. So, which means it obliges us to have another future vision and push for that and work hard for that, because they are. So I sometimes say that we're, as far as I know, and I'm not a biologist or zoologist, but we're the only species on the planet that can actually imagine things we haven't seen. All right, and I can imagine it so vividly that I can actually tell you about it, either verbally in writing or illustration, whatever. Then I could actually convey something to you that you've never seen either, to an extent that you can imagine it as well. The future is something none of us have seen. So it is a story that we tell each other. And the more compelling the story, the more convincing that I am, the more gains that it brings to whoever makes this happen, well, that story is going to win, right? So again, saying that the future is negative, it means we're diving into those who are already pushing their visions very hard and say, okay, you guys go ahead. We're just going to wait and see what happens, because, you can have competing visions. So the future is not negative. And I hate to do the whole butterfly effect, but looking at where we are now, well, that also started a long time ago, right? This has not just happened. The Draghi report came out. And, it's like Moses, he came down from the mountain carrying 700, basically, stone plates. It was a heavy exercise. What surprises me is the surprise. So seriously, this has been so long time coming. How can we be surprised? But that aside, to me, I'm going to go straight back to 2024 and say, okay, guys, what is around us now that is so obvious that 15 years from now, another Draghi is going to write another report, and we go, oh my God, really? And it's already starting now, but we're refusing to see. So yes, let's look at Draghi, and let's look at the competitiveness in Europe and everything else in Europe. But also let's look around and see what will we be writing reports on 15 years from now that is already extremely obvious, but we just don't want to look.
Oh, I love that so much. Yeah, what is so obvious today that you can look to the future 15 years out and play out those what if scenarios? And maybe the future is neutral, but you can have hope that you have some control in it. So beautifully said, and a beautiful way to end the conversation. Dasha, I would gladly go on a road trip with you, maybe not over the cliff's edge, but have a podcast take two on the road. Super insightful and thought provoking. One last question for you. So looking outside, obviously the theme of the show, what's your go-to?
I've been thinking about it. Actually, I find time to have an interesting conversation with my daughter, my stepdaughter, because I've realized many times she's challenged my worldview more than anyone that I've ever met. And she's now 20, which means she's an actual articulate adult. And simple thing like gender roles or perceptions of society, sometimes she would just look at me and go, but why? And I don't have an answer. And we've passed the age where I could just tell her because. So I think actually my go-to to seriously look at myself from the outside is actually a lunch or conversation with her. I just realized that when you asked me that this is probably where I had the most, wow, I have my own biases moments. So and anyone who's basically wants to hear the truth, invite a reflective, well-articulated young person to a dinner or a lunch or a walk and then discuss things and see how they see them. And rather than convince them they're wrong, just listen because many people share their views in the future and we better listen now.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said to just listening, or maybe even thinking back to when you were 20 and what were some of the things that you question? Why is it the way that it is that now you've assimilated to? We all need to go back to our 20-year-old selves as well. Yeah, some of it. Dasha, just absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you. We do that road trip and I'll bring maps.
I'll bring Brad Pitt, hopefully.
Deal.